Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. Now, to quote Dave from Slot R YouTube channel, today is a good day because today I have a box from George at Area 51 Raceway, and he runs different proxy races through the year. And I said to George, I would love to scratch build something and send it to you. And he said, well, do it, you're more than welcome. And he got me sorted out and he's sent me all the parts in this box and find out what's in it. And find out what we got. And then we move on to the meat of the parcel, which is the Midget Racer in 1/20th scale. So there they are, my little alien deliveries from Area 51, courtesy of George. Thank you very much, George. I'm going to get stuck straight into this slot now, and I'm going to create a slot car. Okay, so because I'm totally unfamiliar with this class of racing, this type of car and this kit, and I've got to design the chassis from scratch anyway, I'm going to build this plastic kit in its most basic form so that I can just get a feel for what's going on and what I need to do with it. Now, George tells me that the outside width of the wheels has to be 3 inches, so that much I do know, and I guess I can put the guide tongue pretty much wherever I want to. So I know that, but I don't know anything else. So let's get this kit built in its very, very basic form, and then I can start working out how I'm going to attack the chassis. Okay, so that's got the basic kit onto the CB design wheels to give me an idea of how everything's going to fit together. And so far, the back end is about 1/8 of an inch too wide, and the front end is about 1/4 of an inch too wide. So I now know what sort of detail I'm dealing with on the front and rear axles. So now it's the time to get the motor plate bolted to the motor and get the car turned upside down so I can see how well the motor fits into the relief that I've already pre-cut, so that then I can think about tying the motor pod to the front end and how that's going to look through the underside of the car. So let's crack on with that. Okay, so that's the motor screwed onto the motor bracket, and now we can offer it up to the underside of the car, and we can see that it's a little bit too wide for the slot. Now I put the slot at 16.5mm and this motor is about 21.5mm. But you could still just about see that there will actually be enough room for this motor to slide in between this plastic and still retain quite a lot of this tumble home, and I don't want to remove that. And also we can see now exactly where the motor is going to sit in relation to the body. So there's the hole there where the axle goes, the plastic axle from the kit goes through that hole there, and you can see it lines up more or less with the hole for the bearing. So now we know roughly where the motor is going to go. So we now know that that bulkhead is in the way, as we already knew anyway, and we know it's all going to fit. So the motor, when it sinks in to the body in line with the back axle, I can just about tell that the bottom of the motor is going to fit flush to the bottom of the body. Now I'm not sure if the rules allow to lower the body. I shall ask George, and if it does, that will help. Now the only problem is there's a slight twist to my car, because I actually want to fit rear suspension to it, which means I would like to turn this bracket upside down like that, and then run in this space that's created here a thicker brass rod running in that corner recess, because the motor is kind of got all its corners knocked off. So that brass rod will actually sit right in that corner and give us space just for everything to clear. And that will actually clear, as you can see, the bottom of that mount, which means then I can make some bracketry on the back of this wire here to mount some flaps onto here and some springs and everything else, and I can actually have suspension like that on the back of the car, which I think might help. Who knows? Don't know. It's just a bit of fun, but it's worth a try. I mean, why just build a straight car? That's boring. Let's make it really difficult. So that's that. So I need to consult George and make sure that, well, to see what I can do with the height of that axle and see where the rules are, and then I can crack on and see if I can get this all folded up into something that resembles a chassis with suspension. So that is the actual motor mount all done. Now you may be asking yourself, why have I done it so close when most people build the bearings right out to here? And the reason for that is because this axle is a phenomenally nice fit on these bearings. There is no discernible play in that whatsoever. It's a beautiful fit. These American bushes and axles are very, very nice. So I'm very, very confident that I'm not going to get any sort of axle wobble. So I'm able to confidently build this chassis the way that I want to, and that means building those bearings as tight as I possibly can to this motor mount. And the reason why is because I've already ground out everything on the inside of this body so it's completely smooth, and trimmed away the little bit of recess that was on the side there, so these sides are now completely flat, because I need to fit this motor mount upside down, because it's a 0 degree motor mount, so I can turn it either way. Pop it in there upside down, and I want to fit it inside the body like that, so that the only thing that's sticking out of the body itself is the axle, because I'm trying to build this car as close to scale as reasonably possible without going completely overboard, and that means not having this great big 1/4 inch tube hanging right out, making the whole thing look a bit heavy. I just want the axle coming out, and then I should do some extra detail from here coming out the same as the real ones, and we'll do something on the front. But I want to try and keep the whole thing inboard, and I need a little bit of clearance as well, because as I say, I want suspension in it, and so that's why I've done that. And I've asked George, and he says that we are allowed to drop the body down to about maybe 1/8 of an inch ground clearance. So I've got myself an extra 1/8 of an inch, which means hopefully, if I get this right, I'm hoping, and I don't know if I will be able to do this, but I'm hoping to be able to thread the whole chassis in this way. Because they're now flush, I can thread the whole chassis in this way and bring it down, drop it into place, pin the body somehow, and then I can drop the engine detail in and put the bonnet on, maybe with magnetic catches, I'm not sure, but I'm hoping to be able to go in from the top, which means I don't have to recess this chassis, open the chassis up anymore, which means I get to keep all this full tumble home. Removing the bottom is absolutely fine, that can go, but I'd rather be able to get as much tumble home as possible and thread the whole chassis in through the bonnet. That may not be possible, I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. This is a journey. So let's get on to the next stage, which I think is going to be creating the sub chassis, the framework underneath this motor and around the end, and then back up this here, and try and create some sort of motor mount pivoting on the end bell of the motor. But actually, before I need to do that, I'd like to get these gears in and get them all meshing. So I'm going to have to cut this tube now and gently file back and forth until this is a perfect fit on the pinion. And if I get it a little bit wrong, it's no big deal. I can always put a nylon washer on either side, a shim washer or a very fine shim. I've got some very fine metal shims, and I can shim it in either direction so that this gearbox is then completely self-contained, doesn't need any other retainers, it's all self-contained within this here. So let's crack on, let's get these gears into this pod and then make up a frame. Well, that was super annoying. I've just gone and made this gap exactly correct and forgot to hit the record button. But basically all I did was came in with the Dremel and I cut the tube on both sides and kept on nibbling away until this gear was fitting in between, and it was a bit too tight on the pinion, so this side here needed filing down. And to do that, I just used my file very, very carefully, very, very slowly, just filed that tube down until the gear fitted perfectly and there was exactly the right amount of backlash, making sure that my axle was still nice and free to move. And then once the gear is assembled, there is exactly the correct amount of backlash. So I put them in there, nip up the grub screw very, very gently. And now hopefully you'll be able to see there is a small amount of backlash there, quarter, and a small amount there, quarter. There's a small amount there, and another quarter, and there's a small amount there. You may not be able to see it on camera, but it definitely is there. And then when you put the motor to the battery, you get it all running nicely. So that's that. So now what I need to do is make up a frame to go underneath to start the chassis. That was quite a lot of fast forward work to complete all this fiddly chassis work, but really all I've got is a piece of 1.75mm brass in the middle, notched, to take the 332 brass wire around the outside. Then I've got the two suspension posts soldered into place, and they are just Slotting Plus suspension kit screws from the Slotting Plus kit, and they're really just smooth shanked brass bolts. And then there's an alloy cap to go on the top, and that alloy cap holds the spring. Now I didn't use the standard springs in the kit, I actually used these slightly heavier springs, and I cut these from some stash of springs that I've got, a longer length, cut about 5 or 6 coils, and I flat the ends of the coils back. And all you do to flat a coil is you heat up half of a coil to bright red with a blowtorch or a cigarette lighter, and then you can just push it against a metal surface and it flats off the end of the spring beautifully, so you get a really nice end of your spring. So there's 2 heavier duty springs there to complete that. Now this piece here is to actually support the motor mount, and it sits in like that, and it's got tapered edges on this. The sides start to taper from halfway up, because that engages in the bottom of this motor mount, and then the sides are tapered in to allow the motor mount to rock, otherwise it couldn't rock. And what this does is it's notched into the bottom of the chassis as well, so that all the side load that happens on the back wheels isn't taken up by these 2 brass screws. This actually carries the side load, and that's why it's notched into the chassis, so it's a really good mechanical fit. So that takes a lot of the side pressure, and then these little fine posts here really only have to deal with the suspension springs, so that's all easy to handle for those, and that does the majority of the work. Then obviously then we've got the back end motor mount here. Now full disclosure, this is a Mark II mount. The one you saw me make just a second ago, I wasn't very happy with it. It was a bit too fine in the back here, so I just made another one just a little bit deeper to give me more on more wings here to solder to, just to make it that little bit more robust. So that's the chassis. And then the motor mount is simply the original motor mount, obviously bearings soldered in, we've seen that before, and we've got little angles here coming off. They're scalloped in, so they go around the bearing, across the bottom, so they're well supported. Two little holes in the top to take the suspension bolts, and this bar across the top here is soldered in there to keep the distance of the bearings perfectly spaced, so that the axle is still completely free to slide in and out without any issues at all, and I can't actually get this distance here to close up and compromise the suspension movement. So that's what that's for. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to assemble this all up together, and then I can show you it all working as one unit. And there we are. So that's the back end all fully assembled, so you can see what's going on. So we can see the motor mount here pivoting on the end bell. That's a really snug fit in there. It moves, but it's not slack. And then we've got the reinforcing bar here to stop these side plates from moving and pinching the bearings, because the bearings are such a good fit. Any movement of these plates binds up the bearings, so that's there to stop that. We've got the reinforcing stroke limiter plate on the inside here to give pressure to the sideways forces to support that, and also as a limit for the suspension side movement. We've also got the springs on the back and the little keeps to hold the springs at the bottom. You've got this little tiny spacer that I made up to go in here that's 28 thou thick, and that just takes up that gap between the tube and the boss of the gear. I don't think it does a huge amount. It limits the amount of movement going into the gear. The gear itself does that, but it probably just does something. So basically now there's absolutely no movement in that back gear bar the minutest amount of end float. I don't know if the camera's picking that up, but there's a very, you can hear it in fact. There, so you can hear it and feel it, but not so much see it. So that controls all of the movement there. And the actual suspension, you can see moving here. Yes, it is all close to that gear, but nothing's hitting the gear at all. And also the movement that goes that way as well. And the springs are reasonably firm. We'll see how it works. I've no idea if the suspension idea is actually going to work in practice, but you know, we'll find out together down on George's track. But so there's the back end, all completely done. And now we've got to move on to the front end. So now the back end is done, probably arguably the hardest bit. The front end shouldn't be too difficult. We're going to have a plate coming off the top and a plate coming off the bottom, or something like that. Bottom one obviously holds the guide. Top plate obviously holds the front end. And hopefully that should go a little bit easier. Not that this was immensely difficult, but it's fiddly work. Hopefully the front end will go in pretty quickly. We can get this all done up so the chassis is a complete working chassis. Okay, so after much thought of how I can go about getting the front end all in place, I've finally decided on a way of doing it. Now I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing here with this kit. I'm totally unfamiliar with it. So I'm just going to have to pick an idea that I've thought of and go with it and see where we're at the end of the build. If this car doesn't perform particularly well, then I can learn from that. And if it performs reasonably well, then great. And I'm deliberately not looking at other people's designs because I don't really want to be influenced by what other people do. So that means that this car will be hopefully an original thought process. But if it copies what other people have done, then that's just luck. But I'm going to choose my idea, one of many, and I'm going to run with it. So I won't explain it to you, I'll just do it, and then you can see it at the end. So on to fast forward we go. Okay, so that's the chassis all finished with regards to the front axle. And I'll show you what's going on here. Take off the wheel. So you can see now that any impacts on this front axle will be taken through this piece of brass, through that joint, and then obviously off into the chassis, but it's all going to be transferred through that half lap joint right there. So the solder isn't actually taking up any of the impact. The solder is purely there to hold these bits of metal together. And the same with the front tongue. The front guide is actually going to be a drop arm, and it'll sit there like that, and it'll swing down for compensation. And I shall make a hinge that runs across here, but again there'll be a pin through this piece of metal, so any frontal impacts will be pulled on these two pieces of metal here, or through here, and again through that joint there. So again, there's no solder taking any impacts. It's a physical joint that's in there. So let's crack on. Let's get that front drop arm done. And there it is, the chassis finished, complete with rear suspension and a sprung front guide drop arm. And there we can see the pin that I've put across to form a hinge with a piece of 0.5 nickel silver wrapped around the guide arm, soldered all in place. I've got my threaded bolt running through the chassis to control the drop, and if we look deep inside there, you can see a plastic shim to control the ride height and the very fine spring that gives it just a light amount of spring. If you turn it upside down, it's barely got enough power to return the guide, but it is working nicely. So that plastic shim controls the height of the front axle. So when we put it on the setup plate, we've got the front wheels turning, but they're also very, very free to turn by hand. So those front tyres are barely doing anything at all by just supporting that front end of the car. And to control the side movement on the front axle, what I did is I cut the brass tube and I inserted this axle stopper right in the middle, so that now stops any side to side. There's a little bit because you don't want it too tight, but there's not a lot. So that's all that done. Okay, so with the chassis all finished, it's time to turn my attentions to the body. So to start the body, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually glue half of the bonnet to this nose cone, and I've already cleaned up this joint line ready to go. So it's just a simple case of putting some elastic bands on the bonnet and then gluing it from the inside, and then we can move on to the next bit. And there we are. That was the logic for only gluing half of the bonnet, because if you recall a little while ago I did suggest that I was hoping to be able to get the chassis into the car through the engine bay. Well, that was becoming blatantly obvious that that wasn't going to be possible no matter how much trimming that I did. So the other alternative I thought of was to cut the nose cone off but leave leave the bonnet on it, and then I could do some sort of latch up here and some sort of way to lock it at the bottom. Not quite sure how that's going to look at the moment, but that's kind of where I'm going with it. So perhaps what I can do is pass a pin through here that's part of the front end steering geometry or something like that to hold the nose in, with a little clip at the back. So you'd have to take a wheel off, pull out the steering geometry bar, that would release the nose cone, and then you can just unclip the top from that and take away the front and get to your internals. But of course you shouldn't need to get to the internals very often, if ever, to be fair. So no matter how convoluted it will be to get the interior out, shouldn't ever really need to be done. So that's where I've gone with that, doing it as a two-piece. So there's a little bit more fiddling around to do, a little bit more filing inside here to get this whole thing in, but it will now at least in its essence fit. So there it is. There is the chassis inside the body with a removable nose cone. Okay, so there we are. That's getting us pretty close, I think you'll agree. So this back wheel, or the bearing, has to fall in line with this panel line here, which it does. A little bit of trimming on the back to allow that to happen. Same on the other side, falls exactly where it's supposed to be. These side panels here fit perfectly on the inside of the body, and you can see the Predator motor sticker, which is most important. And also the bonnet or hood now fits, and it's perfect on that front bearing on both sides. So that's got us to that point now, and I've cleaned up all these joints as well so they're nice and smooth. I think the next job is to get the seat back in, profile it, and then pop it in, and then cut out this existing bulkhead that's already there, because I'm going to make a better one, and then this one can go, don't need the extra weight. And I think while I'm at this stage I'll make the front grille fit. So once I've got those two bits done, I'll try and get the driver fitted as well with a bit of a lean and move his arms and so on, so he looks good in there. And then I'll try and work out some way of locking in this bonnet system here on the front, and then try and work out some way of pinning the body to the chassis. And then we're probably getting fairly close to the painting stage. So let's try and work out those next problems. Okay, so that was a lot of fast forward work, so I'll just summarise what I've done. So I've cut a new seat back with the nice pleats in there, cut out the bulkhead behind it, and then glued it in so that it's sitting nicely in a rebate but with no extra material. I've also then put in these seat base stops down at the bottom here, making sure they've got clearance for the motor. I cut the new seat base, cut the bottom of the legs of the man off so he's got a bit more of a lean to him. I was able then to cut into his arms and then open his arms up and then glue his arms into the correct position and then backfill all the holes with filler and sand him all in so his arms are in a little bit more of a dynamic position than they were as a standard kit. I was able also to then glue in this steering wheel extension and get the steering wheel a little bit further off the dashboard because it doesn't look good as a standard kit because it's a little bit too squashed in there. Then I moved on to the chassis and I made up this little mount on the back of the chassis so I could screw the chassis into the body. I then fitted these little stops in the front here which grip around the front of the chassis up here to hold the chassis in place, and I also glued in these reinforcing bars down the side of the chassis to give this whole section here a little bit more strength because I'm relying on these clips here to hold the front end in. I don't want the flexing of this particular part of the body. I'd rather shed it all the way down the side, so putting those bars in there give it all the stiffness it needs. I was then able to think about getting the front bonnet all into place. So by doing, I've put this cross member in here and then put a magnet inside and also put a magnet on a little upstand on the front of this chassis here so it all locks in and registers. I've also screwed the motor down to the chassis, taken a bit off the bottom of the chassis as well because it was too high in this new chassis because as standard the kit engine sits in the bottom of the body down here, but my new chassis is up higher so I had to take a bit off the motor. And also for the sake of having a little bit less weight high up, I've chopped the top of the motor off because when it's under the bonnet you hardly see anything above the exhaust. There's no point having all that weight, so you can see here how much clearance or how much weight I've managed to shed because that was almost full in the standard kit, so that's all been removed. And then I was able to adjust the exhaust pipe. So all I've done is I've machined the back of the exhaust pipe here up by the headers to accept this tube, slide the brass tube over, glue it into place, solder in this standoff and slash cut the end and then drill a hole in the body to take it. So I'll just assemble all these parts up together now and you can see what it looks like together. And there it is. That's most of the car mostly put back together again. It's just missing a few details. Obviously all the metal work for around the outside of the body needs to go on and the wheel centers. Other than that it's kind of there. And there you can see the driver's lean and his arms outside of the cockpit, whereas the standard plastic kit has his arms fully welded to the side of his torso, which doesn't look as dynamic. He's holding his brake lever. You can see the steering wheel just hovering off the dashboard there, which gives it a little bit more relief. You can also see the rear suspension like that, and it goes up and down like that. And we can see the exhaust pipe running down with the reinforced brass replacement main pipe and a little brass standoff. You can also see how far the headers come below the bonnet line, so spot on. And also the nose cone comes off. Now we can see how much engine I've removed to try and get some of the weight down. I know it's got quite a lot of weight above that, but there's no point having extra weight on top of the engine doing absolutely nothing when it can't even be seen. At least with the detail over here you can see it all. With that detail is just detail for the sake of it, doesn't do anything. And the bonnet has got its little magnets on and it literally just snaps back into place like that. Pulls back in with the magnets, no problems at all. Now you can see the grille all in place. I haven't glued it in yet, and all the front bearings. So that's that. Now we need to get on with all the metal work around the outside, putting the centre of the wheels in, and then we could probably start thinking about paint. Okay, so that's the beginnings of the suspension units, and as you can see, I turned up these little tiny end caps on the lathe first, bent a small piece of brass 90 degrees, put it in a jig to flatten that bend out as tight as I could possibly get it, filed a little rebate right on the knuckle of the bend, bent up these long brass wires, cut them in half, opened up the gap with them clamped in the vise to make the gap controlled, and then mounted them all on the solder board, soldered them into place. So now we've got what more or less represents what the real cars had, with the joint on the end in a threaded shaft with the upper and lower links. So let's crack on, finish the rest. Okay, I'm not going to lie, it was a week since I turned the camera on, and I've just got on and made all this brass detail bit by bit through the evenings, because to be fair, it was quite tricky, very fiddly and quite delicate work to do. So I've sort of taken it piece by piece through the evenings and made it as I go, had a bit of a rest and then tackled another little bit. So you can see that I've got basically the steering cross member running across, holding the bottom of the suspension arms, and I've made a little metal plate, little concave plate on the end of the steering arms that kind of half wrap around to the front axle, and they kind of simulate the bar that the suspension arms would sit on. And then we've got the little steering angle here, which would go onto the hub, what would be the front wheel hub, and that's all held on by a little upturn off of the steering arm as well through the little tube, and that kind of all holds it all in place. I'm hoping the camera picks that all up. And then the other side is a little bit simpler, where you've just got the steering arm coming out the chassis and then going to this little plate here to sort of simulate the steering arm, I guess. And then the front bumper, I wish my name wasn't Rob, because R's are quite difficult to solder up, but I think it worked out okay in the end. So that's that, and the way that I fitted the front bumper onto the front of the car was purely on the actual nose cone. It's all hooked through on the inside and glued and together, and because there's 2 points of pivot here and here and they're off center, it makes that nice and strong. Now I've got the front end removed, you can actually see a little bit more the interior of how this front end of how I've actually done it. Hopefully the camera's picking this up. And we've got a little tiny button here that I've turned on the lathe to finish the end of the steering arm. Just makes it look a little bit neater, makes it a bit more coherent as a model. And there we are. So with all that lot done, I think it's now time to disassemble it and actually start getting some paint on it. The completion of my Atlantis Models 1/20th scale Midget Racer converted to a slot car, all ready to send to George at Area 51 in America so that it can run in the December 2024 proxy race for the midget cars. So be sure to subscribe to George's channel, where in due time I'm sure he'll be unboxing this particular car, running it around his track just to get a feel for it, and then obviously in December there'll be the whole race. So how did I find this build overall? In some respects, it was quite challenging because I did this without doing any research at all. And every time I came up to a mechanical issue or a design issue, I just thought it through in my own head and worked it out as I went along. I didn't follow anybody else's designs, which kind of made it a little bit difficult because I was starting from a completely blank piece of paper. Having never actually made a car like this before is a little bit of a shot in the dark. It's also a different scale. I've not ever worked in 1/20th scale. This is probably closer to 1/24th, but even still, it's still a different scale. So those things are a little bit challenging to do. So I think the whole thing has turned out pretty reasonable. I'm fairly happy with it. There's two things on it which I would like to really change. One is the air filters that I made on the lathe at the very end of the build. I've made them a little bit too thin. They looked okay on the lathe, but really I need to remake them again and make them a little bit thicker just so they look a little bit better when you view it from the side here. And the other thing was, unfortunately, the area where the windscreen glues to or bonds to actually snapped. The two halves of the body kit came apart right at the very end of the build. I tested it all the way through the build and it felt really strong. Then right at the very last, when I was putting the dashboard in, as I spread the body to put the dashboard in, it split straight through the middle. So I had to repair that yellow stripe right in the middle of the body here, which has meant that the whole body is just shifted ever so slightly. So when the bonnet goes on, it doesn't quite butt up as nicely as it used to when I was building it. It's unfortunate, but what are you going to do? You get to the end of the build, it's all painted, and that happens. You just got to bear with it, repair it, and make the best of a bad job. It's okay now, but when I look at it, I know it's not quite as good as it was, but sometimes you just got to live with it. The rest of the kit's okay, so it is what it is. And also, I'd like to give special thanks to my daughter and her boyfriend for painting my driver figure for me. For some reason, I don't like painting figures. I can, but I just don't like to. And she did a really nice job on it. I think we'll all agree she's done a nice job on it, and her boyfriend. I think her boyfriend did the steering wheel, the wooden rim, and she did 99.9% of the actual painting of the driver. And all I did afterwards is just went over it and put some satins and mattes and gloss varnishes on it just to seal her work in so it doesn't get rubbed off when we're playing with it. But all in all, I think the whole thing looks really nice. I think it looks really nice. I think it's come out pretty well and I'm fairly happy with it. So now the whole job is finished, how do I feel it runs? I think it runs okay. I've actually got nothing to compare it to, and I can only run it round my Ricard Valley track because it won't fit round Crow Valley because it's too tall to go through the tunnel. So I've got nothing to compare it to. I've also never raced on an oval track before, so I don't even know what that feels like. It's an American thing. I will be getting an oval track at some point fairly soon, so bear with me on that. But at the moment, I have no reference to oval racing. But on Ricard Valley, it feels okay. It doesn't seem to want to do anything naughty. It doesn't seem to want to tip over particularly. The tyres grip fairly well. Again, I don't know how well these tyres grip on Ricard Valley compared to George's track in America. No idea. But as far as I'm concerned, it seems to run okay. Will that suspension work or will it hinder the car? Don't know. Don't really care, to be honest with you. The drop arm shouldn't be a problem. I think I've seen that design on many other cars. The suspension idea, it may work, but I may just have the springs too soft or they might be too hard. Who knows? At the end of the day, I've had a lot of fun building this car and I'm really enjoying being part of a bigger process on YouTube with this proxy race and being involved with George, Harry and Dave, Shotgun Dave, and just doing the whole thing as a whole. It's been really nice to get that interaction and be part of a bigger project. I think it's just nice to do that. Whether the car goes well or not, it doesn't really matter. It's part of that community and that's what it's all about. It's the community. So on that note, be sure to subscribe to George's channel because I'm sure in a few weeks' time he'll be unboxing this car, so you'll see it actually run round the track at the same time as me, and also obviously in December you'll see the proxy race. George has got a really great channel there, and Shotgun Dave and Home Racing World with Harry running that side of things. Between the three of them, it's a really good little group, and you really should join if you haven't done already. So on that note of subscribing, if you've enjoyed this content, maybe you'll subscribe to this channel. And if you could hit the little bell button, that would be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.